We continue now at the top of Daf Zayin Amud Aleph Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 7a. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing the question of whether carbon ola is mechaper an asay la'achar hafrosha, meaning to say, if there was a violation of a mitzvah asay after the carbon ola was designated, after it was consecrated, and then you bring that carbon ola, is it going to be mechaper on those mitzvahs asay, or is it only on the mitzvahs asay that occur before the hafrosha, before the designation of the animal? And the Gemara brought a proof from a brisa. The brisa had the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said that when it comes to the seirei atzeres, the goats, which are carbon chatases, the goats of atzeres, so you bring two of them, and they're mechaper and tumas mikdash v'kadashav. And so the question is, what do you have to bring the second one for, if the first one is already mechaper for tumas mikdash v'kadashav? And so the Bryce explained that the idea is that if there was any tumas mikdash v'kadashav in between the first carbon and the second carbon, that's what the second carbon will atone for. And the Gemara proved from this brisa that the carbon is in fact mechaper and averos that happened after hafrasha, because presumably both of these goats, they were designated, they were consecrated at the same time. You just brought one before the other, and so therefore any aver of tumas mikdash v'kadashav that happened after the first carbon was brought, again it happened after the hafrasha of the second carbon, and you see that it in fact is mechaper on an aver that happened after the hafrasha. And the Gemara gave two answers to the question. First, the Gemara said it's no proof from the brisa, because the brisa might be talking about a situation where actually both karbanos were designated. There was a hafrasha at the exact same time. The Gemara wasn't fully satisfied with that answer, because why would we assume that that's what the pasuk is talking about in designating these goats as karbanos? And so the Gemara gave a second answer, that leiv bezdin masna aleim, that essentially the court makes a stipulation when it comes to karbanos tzibor, these are public karbanos, that really the designation does not take place until the carbon is actually brought, in order that it should be a kapara for these kinds of situations, for the averos that take place in between the first carbon and the second carbon. And so the Gemara in the previous summit then asked, is it really true that Rabbi Shimon holds leiv bezin masna aleim? But Rabbi Yochanan makes a statement with regards to carbon tamid. Let's say you have extra animals that weren't needed for carbon tamid. So Rabbi Yochanan says, ledivrei Rabbi Shimon, that according to Rabbi Shimon, ein niftin tamimim, those animals cannot be redeemed when they do not have a blemish. But ledivrei chachamim niftin tamimim, but according to the chachamim, they can be redeemed even if they do not have a blemish. And Rashi explains, L'divrei Rabbi Shimon ein niftin tamimin, Dehachi gomer la Rabbi Yochanan me Rabbi. This was just a tradition that Rabbi Yochanan had from his Rebbe, De pligi bar Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan, that this issue is a machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan. Rabbi Shimon les lei lev bezdin masna lein. Rabbi Shimon does not hold of the idea that the court stipulates lahachshiran litzmidei shana haba, to the extent that they would allow them to be brought for carbon tamids of the next year. You're supposed to use the money from the present year for the carbon tamids. That's the issue over here. So you have these animals, and you want to instead you want to unconsecrate the animals, make them no longer fit for carbon tamid, and then you're going to reconsecrate them for the coming year. And so Rabbi Shimon does not allow that. Lomar to say, hutzruchu, if you need the animal for this year, you need it. V'im lav, and if not, yehei kedoshim l'demehen. So we'll just say that the kedusha that they have is not a kedusha of karbonos. If it's a kedusha of carbon, so in order to redeem it, it needs to have a blemish. That's if it's what's called kadshe mizbeach. But over here we're going to say, Rabbi Shimon does not agree with this, but the Rabbanan do say that these are considered to be kadosh lidemehen. They're just considered sanctified for their value. Sheyiftu osan mimos chulin below mum. Then they could be redeemed. If you would say kadoshim lidemehen, then you could say they can be redeemed from money of chulin, even if without a blemish. V'yotziim lachol, and then they would no longer be considered having the kedusha. V'yiplu demeyem lemoser truma, and then that money is going to go to the extra truma, the extra funds for the Beis HaMikdash. And then you're going to have the Truma Chadash. You'll take the new money and you'll reconsecrate these animals as karbanos, and that's how you'll be able to use them as a carbon tamid for this coming year. Now, according to the Chachamim, niftin tamimim, this actually is allowed. They can be redeemed even when they have no blemishes. The islahu leiv bezin masna lein, because they hold, the Chachamim hold, that the bezin makes such a stipulation. Tanai said they can make this condition that even though they were sanctified for the purpose of bringing carbon tamid for the previous year, we're going to say that's just a kedushas damim, that's part of the stipulation of the courts, and it can be redeemed and then reconsecrated. And the point is, Alma, you see, less le Rabbi Shimon leiv bezdin masna alein, that Rabbi Shimon does not hold leiv bezdin masna alein the isla yuchshuru l'tmidin v'lo yekaitzu, because if he held that, then they could even be kosher for carbon tamid. You wouldn't need to use them for the olas hamizbeach in the summertime. That's what we said in the previous summit, that Rabbi Shimon does allow these animals to be used yikaitzu, to be used for the kayitz hamizbeach. Those are the extra nedavas that are brought on the mizbeach in order that the mizbeach is not batal in the long days of the summer. But that's what he allows. But he does not allow yuchsharu tamidin. He doesn't allow them to be used as carbon tamid in this fashion. Ela lesle lev bezin masna. He therefore, you see, he doesn't hold lev bezin masna kach shamati b'shvuas. That's what I heard in Shvuas. And so therefore, it does not seem that we can answer that Rabbi Shimon is understanding lev bezin masna aleim over here when it comes to the seirei atzeres. And the Gemara continues and challenges the other reason the Gemara gave on the previous Amud why there's no proof from the Braisa that a carbon can affect a kapara on an aver that happens after hafrasha. Again, the other answer was that maybe the second carbon, the second soyer, was actually separated after the first carbon was brought. There was not hafrasha at the same time, but rather the hafrasha of the second carbon took place later on, bazeh arzeh. And so the Gemara challenges that. V'yod and further, haboy minei Rabbi Yirmiyah me Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked Rabbi Zera the following question: Seirei Atzeres shekibel daman b'shnei kosos. Let's say you have seirei atzeres, the two goats, carbon chatas of atzeres of shavuos, and at the same time they were slaughtered, you received their blood in two separate cups. V'nizrak damo shal rishon, and then the blood of the first one was thrown. So sheni l'mahu ba. What is the second one for? What's it to atone for? Al tuma sha'ora bein zrika shel zeh lazeh. It's in order to atone for any tuma that happened between the zrika of the first one and the zrika of the second one. And so the point over here was this was a question of Rabbi Yirmiyah from Rabbi Zera, and so the Gemara says, Ad kan lo mi boile. The whole question involves el asei de la'achar shchita. Here you have a situation where they were both shechted at the same time, and so then there was a violation of an asei after the shchita. So the question was, could the zrik of the second one, could that atone for a violation of an asei, violation again of a situation of tumas mikdash v'kadashav that took place after the shchita? Aval asei de la'achar hafrasha. But let's say it would just be an asei, a violation of an asei, an avera that took place after just the designation of the carbon. Lo kami boile, that's not even a question. In other words, it sounds like from the question that the only issue is whether it can be mechaper and an aver that takes place after the shchita. That is a question by a carbon that's mechaper. Does that kapara work? But apparently it's obvious that the kapara is in fact effective in a situation where it's la'achar hafrasha. But the Gemara says to that, Dilma maybe imtim salomar ka'amar. Maybe in this question of Rabbi Yirmiyah from Rabbi Zera was just an imtim salomar. If you're going to say that there's a kapara for asay la'achar hafrasha, what about if it would be la'achar shchita? And therefore there is no proof necessarily from that question that it is obvious the answer to our question that there's a kapara for asay la'achar hafrasha. And Rashi explains, V'yod and further, inami bois l'meimar dekro dochik. If you're going to say that we'll force the pasuk, umuki anafshe k'sheyifrishon bazachar, that will say that we're talking about a situation where they were separated one after another. In other words, one soyer was separated and it was brought as a carbon, and then you'll say that the other one was separated and consecrated after, and so therefore it's not an answer to our question because we're not talking here about a violation that took place after hafrasha. Uvetuma de erev yomtiv kamer, we're talking about the tuma of erev yomtiv. But can you really say that the tuma that happened between hafrasha, but there was a question again. This question was asked b'shtei kosos. Let's say they were slaughtered at the same time. They were slaughtered at the same time. Ve'in shos la'oroe tuma bein shchitasein, and there is no time for tuma to have happened between the slaughterings. V'nizrak damo shal rishon sheni lo makarev, and so then the first one, the blood is sprinkled, the blood is thrown. So what about the second one? Is that going to be a kapara? Rabbi Shimon harei ein tuma bein zelazeh. According to Rabbi Shimon, there's no tuma between them. V'yamar le, so he said the tuma shora bein zrikaso shalzeh lizrikaso shalzeh. We're talking about the tuma between the zrika of the first one and the zrika of the second. And the point over here is as follows: Ad kan lo mi boy afilo Rabbi Yirmiyah. Even according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, lo mitama, he's only asking the question: El im mechaper asay de la'achar shchitaso. If the kapara will work on a violation of an asay after the slaughtering, ilo, or if not, mechlal de pshita le, that implies that it's obvious to him the bein zeh lo zeh de kamer Rabbi Shimon b'tomas yomtiv, that when Rabbi Shimon says the kapara between this one and this one b'tomas yomtiv kamer bein shchitaso shel zeh l'shchitaso shel zeh, he's obviously talking about the tuma between the slaughtering of the first one and the slaughtering of the second one, and he's talking again about asay de la'achar hafrasha. The whole question is if you have an asay la'achar shchita, but certainly Rabbi Shimon in the Braisa is saying that an asay la'achar hafrasha is in fact a kapara. And the Gemara said, no, dilma imtim salomar kamer. Maybe the way the question is being phrased is just an imtim salomar, meaning dilma tarvayu kami boile. Maybe really here's a question on both situations of asay la'achar shchita and asay la'achar hafrasha. V'hachi kami boile, and his question is as follows: Hai bein zeh lo zeh dekam Rabbi Shimon. When Rabbi Shimon says there's a kapara between the first carbon and the second, kodem hafrasha koi, is that talking before hafrasha? O lachar hafrasha koi, or is it talking lachar hafrasha? Meaning again, is there going to be a kapara on an assay that happens lachar hafrasha? V'imtim solomon, if you're going to say achar hafrasha nami koi, that it's even going lachar hafrasha, even if you had the avera lachar hafrasha, it can be an atonement. So kodem shchita or afilu lachar shchita ad zrika. So then the question is it before shchita or even after shchita, all the way up until the moment of zrika? V'yahader leiyu, and then the response to the question was afilu ad zrika, even up to the moment of zrika can be a kapara. And the point is v'dilma lo kaimalon Rabbi Zera. Maybe we don't hold like Rabbi Zera. This was a question Rabbi Yirmiyah asked of Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera answered la'achar shchita that it's still going to be a kapara, but maybe we don't hold like Rabbi Zera v'lo ifsha tabayin, and therefore our question would not be answered. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Itmar, it was stated the following: Machlokas Amoroim, Toda sheshachta l'shem todas chaveru. If you have a carbon toda that was slaughtered as the toda of his friend, Rabba Amar Ksheira, Rabba says that it is kosher. Rav Chisda Amar Psula, and Rav Chisda says it's psula, it is disqualified. Rabba Amar Ksheira, Rabba says it's kosher. Toda l'shem toda nishchata, because the toda was slaughtered as a toda, and that is sufficient. Rav Chisda Amar Psula, Rav Chisda says it's disqualified. L'shem shlamim didei nishchata ba'inan, it has to be slaughtered as his shlamim. And Rashi explains, Toda sheshachta l'shem todas chaveru, a toda that was slaughtered as the toda of his friend. Lo sheshachta al manashe yischaper ba mi she'eno be'oleh. The case over here is not where he slaughtered it that somebody else who's not the owner should get the kapara. Ve'ein zeh shinoi bailam. And the Gemara here is not talking about shinoi bailam, again, where you had intent for a different owner. That is not the case over here. Ela shinoi kodesh. Rather, this is a case of shinoi kodesh, similar to when a person would slaughter a chatas as an ola. Shahaisa l'ruvein toda u'l'shimon toda. What's happening in this particular case is that Ruvain has a toda and Shimon has another toda. V'shachet es todaso shel zeh l'shem todaso shel zeh. When the person slaughters this toda, he thinks it's the other toda. V'hu adin, and the same would be true. B'shochet chatas chaylev l'shem chatas dam. Let's say a person would slaughter a carbon chatas for the avera of chaylev, the avera of forbidden fat, but instead have in mind for chatas dam, which is the avera of consuming blood. That's the machlokas over here in terms of todas chaveros. So again, it's not a situation of shinoi bailam, but really a situation of shinoi kodesh. So we had a machlokas amoroim ksheira. One opinion says it's kosher. V'ola labailam. When we say kosher over here, we mean totally kosher. It even fulfills the obligation of the owner. Da'afilu shinoi kodesh ein kan. That's not even called shinoi kodesh because he had in mind for a carbon toda. And the other opinion says psul, it's disqualified. Lo also labailam. It's not going to count for the owner. The shinoi kodeshu, because that's shinoi kodesh. Again, Rashi is saying over here, as the Mishnah said, that the carbon itself is still kosher to bring as a carbon, but it will not fulfill the obligation of the owner, according to the one who says psula. And the Gemara said the reason is l'shem shlamim didei ba'inon, it has to be for his shlamim. T'chsev zevach toda shlamav, it says the carbon toda his shlamim, and that's why it is psula, according to the one who says pasul. And Rashi notes v'haita iflug betoda. The reason why they're arguing by toda mishum d'minom maisi rabba siyata lemilse mida Abba Chanan, because Rabba's going to bring a proof from toda from Abba Chanan, as the Gemara is going to say in a moment. Umiu, nevertheless, hu adin l'shar zvachim. This exact same machlokas would apply by other karbonos as well. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabba says, Mino Aminullah, from where can I show that it is actually kosher in this situation? The Tanya, as we learned in the following brisa. The pasuk says, Uvesar zevach todas shalamav biyom hakrivo asivcho. It says that the day that he brings his carbon toda, Abba Chanin Amar Mishum Rabbi Eliezer, Abba Chanin says in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, Ba'al ilame, this pasuk is coming to teach us, Toda sheshachta l'shem shlamim kashera, that if a person slaughters a toda as a shlamim, that is kosher. But shlamim shenishchatu l'shem toda, but a shlamim that is slaughtered as a toda, psulim, those are going to be disqualified. Uma hefresh bein zel lazen, what's the difference between the first case and the second case? Toda kruya shlamim, the difference is that a toda can be called a shlamim, that's why in that case it is kosher. V'yein shlamim kruyan toda, but a shlamim cannot be called a toda, and that's why in the second case it is pasul. And so the Gemara now infers from the brisa, shlamim l'shem toda psula. If you have a shlamim that you slaughter as a toda, that's disqualified. Ha toda l'shem toda kshera, but if you have a toda which you slaughter as a toda, it would be kosher. And my lav is, it does not mean to say dechavre. It means to say that he's slaughtering the toda as if it was somebody else's toda. Exactly our case, and the implication of the brisa is that it's kosher. The Gemara says, lo no, didei, it could be that we're talking about his own carbon toda. and if he would slaughter it as his friend's carbon toda, it would actually be possible. But the Gemara says, Avol dechavre mai, but according to that, if we're talking about, if the inference we're making from the Brisa is toda l'shem toda didei is kosher, then toda l'shem toda dechavre, what are you going to say? Psula, that it's disqualified? Adatani shlomim l'shem toda psula, so then instead of saying in the Brisa that shlomim as a toda is disqualified, listening toda l'shem toda, you might as well just say that a toda as a toda is disqualified, again if it's toda dechavre. V'kol shekain shlomim l'shem toda, and certainly a shlomim as a toda is going to be disqualified, and so therefore it really does seem that the proper inference to make from the Brisa is that toda l'shem toda dechavre is kosher. The Gemara says not necessarily. Shlomim l'shem toda didei itzrich. In the case of shlomim as his toda, it's necessary to teach that case. Itzrich lay, that case is necessary. Because one might have thought, mi the toda kriya shlomim, from the fact that a toda can be called a shlomim, so shlomim nami kriyan toda, one might have thought a shlomim can be called a toda. V'chishachit lehu l'shem toda lichshur, and therefore if he slaughters it as a toda, one might have thought it's kosher. Kamash malan, that's why the Brisa is teaching us in this particular case, but again it will not prove one way or the other in terms of the case of toda l'shem toda dechavre. And Rashi explains, lo didei, no, the proper inference to make is that if he slaughters the toda as his toda, it's going to be kosher. And Rashi says there's somewhat of a chiddush here as well. V'afal pishalo bo al hodoya achas, even though you can have todas, they don't all come for the same thanks. You bring a carbon toda when you have to give thanks, but there can be different scenarios. Diarbo tzrichin lahodos, there are 4 different cases where a person needs to give thanks and bring a carbon toda. Kidaminan bebrachas, like we say in brachas, uchsibahu v'yizbechu zivrei toda, like it's written in Tehillim, v'yizbechu and what happened over here is the person slaughtered a carbon toda when he came back from overseas, l'shem toda and as if it was the toda that he separated from when he got out of the Beis HaAsurin of the prison, and so therefore in that situation, that's what the inference from the Brisa is, that in that situation it is going to be kosher. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Chatas sheshachta l'shem chatas kashera. If a chatas is slaughtered as a chatas, it is kosher. We'll see Rashi in a moment. L'shem ola psula, but if it's slaughtered as an ola, then it is disqualified. My time, what's the reason? V'shachat osal chatas, Amar Rachmana, the pasuk says you slaughtered as a chatas. V'harei chatas l'shem chatas nishchata, and the chatas was slaughtered as a chatas, therefore it is kosher. L'shem ola psula, but if it is l'shem ola, if it's as an ola, then it is disqualified. And Rashi explains, chatas sheshachta l'shem chatas kagon chatas chaylev shenishchata l'shem chatas dam. Like a case could be where a person slaughters a chatas for the avera of chaylev, of forbidden fats, but he's slaughtering it as if it is a chatas for dam, for the avera of blood. So kasher vi also lo, so then it's kosher. It means it's completely kosher. It fulfills his obligation. But psula, but again in the case where it's shechted as an ola, then it's pasul. Psula legamri, it is totally pasul. Kedetanan, just like we learned in the Mishnah, chutz min ha-pesach v'achatas, with the exception of carbon Pesach and carbon chatas, again by carbon chatas, like carbon Pesach, it is completely disqualified if it is not lishma, if there's a shinoi kodesh. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav, and Rava says, Chatas sheshachta al misha mechuyev chatas psula. If a chatas is slaughtered for somebody who's chayav a chatas, that's disqualified. That would be a case of a shinoi bailam. You're not slaughtering it for the owner, you're slaughtering it for someone else who's chayav a chatas. Al misha mechuyev ola kshera, but if it's slaughtered for somebody who is chayav to bring an ola, then it actually is still kosher. That's not considered to be a shinoi bailam. My time, what's the reason? V'chiper olav, because the pasuk says olav, it's a kapara for him. Olav velo al chav. It's a kapara for him, for the owner, and not for his friend. But we understand that to mean chaveiro dumya didei, his friend similar to him, meaning to say b'mechuyev kapara kamoso, somebody who's chayev the same kapara as him. So if you slaughter it for someone else who is also chayev a chatos, then it's psula. But if it's for someone else who's chayev an ola, then it would not be pasul. And Rashi explains, Al misha mechuyev chatos, for somebody who's chayev a chatos, b'shinoi bailam. This is the case again of shinoi bailam. You're changing, you have intent for a different owner. Al menas lizrok dama l'shem chavero hamachuyev chatos kamo. So you have in mind to throw the blood for his friend who is also chayev a chatos just like him. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav, and Rava says, Chatas sheshachta al misha eino mechuyev klum. If a chatas is slaughtered for somebody else who's not liable for anything, so psula, that is disqualified, that's considered a shinoi bailim. And what's the reason for that? She'ein lach adam b'Yisrael she'eino mechuyev aseh, because there's no one in Klal Yisrael who is not at least liable for the violation of some aseh, and therefore everyone is liable to something, so it is considered to be a shinoi bailim. The Gemara will address that this seems to contradict what we said above, because here the Gemara is assuming that a chiyav asay is included within chatos, but the Gemara said above that a karban ola, somebody who's chayiv an ola, is not included within chatos, even though that is a chiyav asay. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav, and Rav says, Chatos mechaperes al chayve asay. A chatos is a kapara for liabilities of an asay as well, in line with what we just said above, that again, everyone in Klal Yisrael is mechuyev asay, and that's included within chatos. A chatos is mechaper and an asay. How do we know that? Mikal v'chomer, we know that from the following, Kal v'chomer. Al chayve krisos mechaperes. If a chatos is able to be mechaper to atone for chayve krisos, for somebody who's liable to get kares, al chayve asay, lo kol shekain, certainly it should be a kapara for somebody who's liable to an asay. The Gemara says, L'meimer debas minahi, but does this mean to say that the chiyuv asay is all considered part of a chatos? But again, as we just said, that contradicts what we said above. V'amar Rava, but Rava said, chatos shashacht al misha mechuyev chatos psula. If somebody slaughters a chatos for somebody else who's chayiv a chatos, it's disqualified. Al misha mechuyev ola kashera, but if it's for somebody who's chayiv an ola, it's kosher. And again, the idea is that it's not bas mina. The idea is that the ola comes for something else. And Rashi explains, She'eno mechuyev asay, there's nobody that's not at least liable to an asay, shelo avar asay, who didn't transgress an asay, uva asay shayach lemeimer chatos, kedem efarish v'yazil, and within an asay, that's relevant to a chatos, as we're going to explain. V'yamar Rava, chatos mechaperes al chayve asay, Rava says, a chatos atones for chayve asay, hilkach mechuyev kapar kamoso, therefore the person is chayv the same atonement as this person of a chatos. And that's why the Gemara asks, lemeimer da asay bas mina de chatos, does that mean to say that asay is of the same kind as a chatos? V'yamar Rava, but we just quoted Rava before, al misha mechuyev ola kashera, that if he slaughters a chatos for somebody who's chayiv and ola, it's kosher. Al malav minehu, you see that it's not of the same kind. Do averos asay biyado, because this person does have averos of a mitzvah asay, shehifresh ola alei, in which he separated an ola for them. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Zayin Amid Beis.